So today I'm here to talk to you all about root collar disorders. So I've been, active in the field of arboriculture really for all of my professional career dating back to the late 90s, and I've dealt with a lot of these issues on trees. And so today I hope to kind of bring you some of my experience from the field, show you some pictures of things out in the field that I've seen and looked at and assessed, and then also kind of relate this to some of the research behind why root collar disorders are an issue. So with that, let's take a look at next slide here, which is still kind of an intro slide, but just kind of an outline of what I'll discuss today. So I know a lot of folks, when I mention the root collar to them of a tree, they ask me what that is. So we'll start by kind of defining that. I'll try to put that into context by talking about also kind of what do we know about tree roots? What do we know from the science that's out there that tells us things about tree root systems? Because they're underground. They're not something that we have readily, visual access to. We really kind of have to work to learn about those and understand them and have information around them. We'll talk about root collar disorders, some of the causes, the symptoms, the treatments. We'll look at some pictures of those in the field and talk about how you assess that and help those plants that maybe have issues from that. And finally, I'll have a few conclusions and to talk about at the end that kind of hopefully wrap this together and help you all apply this to trees in your communities. So first of all, what is the root collar? It's also known as, a root flare is another term for that, but it's an important transition zone from, trunk tissue to the root tissue to the underground part of the plant. So the xylem and phloem are present there. That's the conductive tissue inside trees that conduct water and nutrients up and down and energy up and down the plant. There's lenticels there that facilitate gas exchange. That's important for the function of the phloem. It needs oxygen to do the metabolic processes that the phloem performs. So also our anchor roots, or the structural root system for the tree, arise out of that root collar. And finally, there are photosynthetic cells in the bark. So we know that there's actually a little bit of photosynthesis that goes on in that area that we know as the root collar. And you can see here in these pictures, kind of trees of different ages. So we've got a little red bud, that has a less easy to see root collar there, but it's present all the way up to this giant pin oak, probably a 40-inch plus diameter tree right there, with a very well-defined and visible root collar or root flare. So let's talk a little bit just kind of about, what do we know about roots? Well, we know that a lot of them are very shallow in that top foot of the soil or so, that, a lot of them extend beyond the drip line of the plant, that root systems, have been measured to be 2 to 3 times the drip line of the tree or the spread of the canopy. And there's also been other ways that we've tried to quantify the size of those root systems with tree height, or under other findings here, some studies have found that the diameter of the plant is a better predictor than the canopy width of the size of root system that a healthy tree would have. So as trees age, that root system, the energy put towards root systems changes. There's more energy towards maintenance and less towards growth and expansion of that root system. We know that makes a lot of sense. Impervious root system surfaces restrict root growth. And I've really seen that especially so that it tapers off sharply. As you get close to a driveway, to a sidewalk, to something impervious, it really quickly, we see little to no root growth under those impervious surfaces because roots need water and oxygen and a lot of the things that are in those upper soil layers. So also, those root systems aren't uniformly distributed. Studies have shown that there's more roots on uphill sides of trees and the direction away from the lean and the direction of the prevailing wind. And I'd say in my experience in the field, that's definitely true, that a root system is not this. We see a lot of diagrams that are kind of this, symmetrical thing around the tree. It's not so. It's based off of where those impervious surfaces are, where other things in the environment or environmental conditions that tree's exposed to, how they're interacting with that root system. So from all this, you can kind of conclude that, root systems are dynamic. They're adaptive to that environment. They're large and widespreading, especially compared to the above ground footprint we see of those plants. In a healthy tree, that root system should be much larger than what we see above ground. And most importantly, these root systems are shallow. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions I see a lot, is that a lot of diagrams or discussions show roots really deep. They're actually really shallow. They're in the, that upper foot, again, is where most of those roots occur. A few other things we know, adventitious roots. So not those main structural roots that you see as part of the plant, as part of the main anchoring system for our roots, for our trees. Those adventitious roots that grow outwards more so than down or up. They're going to grow out, not necessarily down or up. There's a lot of barriers with respect to root depth, how deep roots go. There's a lot of barriers listed there to rooting depth. Species matters. There's definitely some differences between different species and how their root systems exist. There's an example where hackberry has been documented to have 23-foot deep roots. Other trees, other specific species have wider or shallower root systems, and there's science that we can use to kind of quantify those. Also, fine roots turn over very quickly. So those tiny roots, all those little tiny roots you see in this picture here of this seedling, they turn over quickly in the soil. And on a larger tree's root system, that has a huge effect on the soil. As those roots expand out, they grow and die, and they leave channels, that changes the soil. That leaves behind nutrients as those tiny root hairs decompose and build soil structure. So there's a lot going on with root systems in the soil. And literature has showed us that over the years. So let's talk quickly now about identification of the root collar. And you can see I have a couple brackets here on this Dawn Redwood and Sugar Maple that kind of show, the area we would classify as the root collar. And so, it's typified by a flare leading to these major buttress roots. And that Dawn Redwood is kind of the perfect example of just an awesome looking root collar. Look at the large buttress roots and the well-defined basal flare. Same with this maple. It has a good well-defined flare there at the ground that's identifying that root system. But when we take a look at this linden, we don't see a root collar there. So on this particular tree, it's really difficult to identify where a root collar starts or stops. And I think as you look at trees around the landscape, there's a lot of them that we see like that. Where, here's a cherry that also looks kind of like the linden tree, a lot like a telephone pole going into the ground. That's how a lot of us arborists have described that over the years. Is if the tree looks like a telephone going into the ground, you don't see that root flare, and it's just not present there on those plants. So over the years, a lot of folks have also seen a correlation between trees that look like telephone poles and health issues. And so we've started to really look at that as a tree care industry, and how do we deal with this issue? How often is it correlated? And we'll look at, again, some of the research a little later that talks about how some of those relationships exist. But it's probably one of the first things that I look at when someone has a tree question for me, or there's a tree health issue to assess. Do we see a telephone pole going into the ground, or can we see a root flare there? So if you see a telephone pole going into the ground, safe to say there is a root collar disorder at hand. So this is kind of my definition of a root collar disorder, just to put a definition on it. But simply put, it's a disorder of that root collar area. But to me, conditions have created an unnatural environment, which typically adversely impacts tree health when we see one of these disorders in place. So I've got some examples of some root flares here with obvious disorders. The cottonwood at the left there has some beaver damage. And I love the picture of that tree. And that's a plant that's close to my house that I've walked by a bunch of times out in the woods. And I just love to see that wound wood growing around, all those beaver-induced wounds to the base of that plant. But, that's an unnatural environment to have a reopened wound constantly happening right there. And that's going to lead to some long-term health issues for that plant, where it was actually caused by a natural cause, a beaver that happened to come by. The shagbark hickory in the middle, pretty common looking, cavity at the base of a tree. We see that a lot in a lot of situations, but I don't really see a great signs of a root flare there. I really don't see great signs of a structural root system that extends towards us from the angle the picture is being taken. So there's obviously some impacts and issues there. You know, the white oak at the right, there's some fungal fruiting bodies. That's a great sign of, you know, you can tell just by looking at the bark on this oak, there's a lot of decay going on there. And that, you know, chicken of the woods fungus there is responsible for some of that decay and is giving us a huge sign that there's problems there. Although we probably could have noticed some of that just from the sloughing and dying bark, the dead wood in front of us. And so now let's look at just a few more examples where we can see some obvious roots at the surface. On the tulip poplar at the left, you can see a root going right across the trunk there. That's what we refer to as a girdling root. The linden tree at the right there, gosh, you really can't miss those girdling roots. So a girdling root is really any root that goes around the trunk and gradually starts to kind of compress that trunk tissue. So I know we talk about them as circling or, you know, girdling and circling roots, but in the case of the tulip poplar, it's just kind of a root at a weird angle there that's kind of cross trunk tissue, but becomes a problem as that trunk tissue starts to become compressed and we start to lose some of that phloem function first, and essentially the tree gets strangled off. Where in the very middle picture there, on this Norway maple, this is it's difficult to see because it's the same color as the soil, but that is a massive complex of girdling root right there that's actually caused, you know, dieback and decay and dead tissue right there. So that's a major disorder of the root collar, and definitely something as arborists would really concern me. And so in this, I popped up another picture here to show that, you know, in all different size plants, we can see examples of girdling roots in all of these pictures where, you know, that 32-inch DBH, that's diameter at breast height, that's kind of a standard forestry measurement tree, doesn't have even as large of a girdling root as we see on that, you know, 18 DBH linden, which, you know, that's a pretty large girdling root around that plant. And in the middle, you know, this black gum, we'll look at this example in a little more detail later, is just 3-inch caliper. So that's a measure taken in the nursery right at the base of the plant, and it's just 3 inches across right there. So different size plants can definitely have these issues, and all can suffer from girdling roots. So when we get back to root collar disorders here, what are some of the causes? You know, soil accumulation over the root collar. I put a big asterisk by this because that is, you know, typically a result of deep planting, but also can occur from construction or grade changes in that area where we've deposited new soil on top of it. But that's really one of the major causes of root collar disorders is either planted, you know, that root flare is buried in the soil for one reason or another. And we can see good examples of that in both the lindens there. We don't see a root flare. And in the case of the linden on the right, we do see a girdling root that's growing around the trunk. You know, physical damage to the root collar area is another pretty common root collar disorder, pretty easy to identify also. In the red maple at the top, that's some pretty bad mower and string trimmer damage. And so that's super common in the landscape. I wish we saw it less, but also another really common disorder that just, you know, is more easily to assess sometimes because we can see the damage and the rot and decay that it's causing. But there's also other things that can girdle or restrict trunk expansion. So we've talked about girdling roots, but in other cases, just compacted soil around that tree that's planted too deep can tend to restrict some of that trunk expansion. And as I've removed soil from trees like the linden at the left, I would guess we probably, if we started to dig the soil out around that plant and try and find the root flare down there, I think we'd probably find some girdling roots, but I think probably also we would find some trunk restriction from that soil being heavily packed in there. And finally, artificial materials around the trunk is another way we see some root collar disorders. And in the red maple at the bottom there, none of the planting material was actually removed. And we'll have a little more discussion of to remove or not remove burlap and what, you know, kind of the science and other folks say about that a little later today. But in that case, I had already pulled back some of that material that was constricting the trunk. I didn't get the best picture of it. I wish I would have had a better picture, but there was twine and other things, just everything left right around the trunk of that little red maple. And as you can see, just looks a lot like a telephone pole going into the ground in that picture. So that tree was not doing well, especially when I looked at twig growth and other things. So what are some of the signs and symptoms then of a root collar disorder? Because a lot of times we may or may not even notice what's going on at the base of the trunk, but there's a lot of stress symptoms similar to other things we see stressing out trees. So yellow foliage, small leaves, really small annual twig growth. That's one of the things that I typically look at first on a plant that I see that seems to be ailing, is that annual twig growth, which you can see from the terminal bud scale scar on twigs pretty easily on most tree species. Another sign or symptom, we've talked about this, no root flare at the soil surface, that telephone pole appearance. Sloughing bark or signs of decay. So in this picture that I show here, this red maple obviously is turning, it has fall colors in August, and this was close to our office. So I drove by it every day and finally got out to look one day, and lo and behold, there's some mower damage there. That tree's had some damage to its lower trunk, either from a mower, from a passing person, whatever's happened to that. But also looks like a telephone pole going into the ground. We don't see much of a flare, so certainly planted too deep. And I had every intention in the world to actually go do a root collar excavation or dig around that trunk. We'll talk about that on the next slide, how we kind of performing a root collar excavation, but the tree unfortunately was not alive the next year, and I missed my opportunity to do that. So, so we may see something as obvious as this big dead section, but sometimes it simply is bark that has a different appearance. It's sunken in, it's dead bark that has a different appearance than other areas due to something that's happened at the ground line or below where we can actually see, and it's kind of sunken in or is sloughing or just looks different. So I spend a lot of time when a tree's having issues inspecting that lower trunk and looking for some of these signs. And sometimes mower damage is not as big as this chunk you see here, and it may be just small nicks around of a larger tree or a larger trunk, small nicks around the base of that trunk that are harder to detect. But sometimes, in some cases, there may be few detectable symptoms before this tree really starts to show health declines. And when I say detectable symptoms, I mean to just your average homeowner, the person that's not typically looking at these plants, because for an arborist or someone that does look at trees a lot, there's often signs ahead of time, such as smaller leaves, not much annual twig growth, a little bit of dieback in the upper canopy. So up at the tips of the canopy, not down in the, not lower down on shade limbs, but up in the tips. And so what we see is, seemingly to a homeowner, a perfectly fine tree that all of a sudden during hot, dry weather, you see the sharp decline and leaf drop and, quick fall color happens. And all of a sudden their tree's in trouble from this. Or even after, winter injury over the winter time. In the spring when it leaves out, we can have a tree that's not doing so great, that seemed to be fine last year, but if a root collar disorder is the cause and there's some trunk strangulation going on, it's possible that trunk strangulation has disrupted the translocation of growth regulators through the phloem that help with hardening off for winter, that can leave a tree a little more susceptible to winter damage. So there's a lot of things in this, the functioning of a tree that can be disrupted when we change what's going on around the root collar area. So what can we do in the way of treatment when we identify some of these problems? Well, as with so many tree ailments, minimizing environmental stress is just a huge thing for any tree that's suffering, whether there's a disease we can treat or not. So, mulching and watering, those are some of the main things we can do to minimize environmental stress. Improving the root zone is another way we can do that. And so we can expand the mulched area. We can remove some of the competition with turf grass that's in the root zone of that tree. We can do things such as vertical mulching that improve the condition of the soil over time with a few applications. So that's where we actually drill holes and replace poor soil with good soil. But we can also do what's called a root collar excavation, and I'll talk about these a little later with some more examples. But it's performed when we see that telephone pole type appearance, like this newly planted bald cypress. We'll look at it in a little more detail later, but basically what we do is dig down and try and find the first root, or those first structural roots that tell us where that root flare starts at. And it takes some time and some digging, but it's not rocket science. Most all of us on this call today can successfully do this with some careful excavation. So we're going to remove that excess soil. We're going to look for girdling roots. That's the biggest thing I'm usually looking for as I'm doing this. Look for signs of decay while we're down there, abnormal looking bark, signs that an area may be dead. And at the end, we're going to leave the root flare at the soil surface. So in my after picture there, you can see I've left, there's kind of a bowl-shaped area right there around the root flare, and that needs to be left there so that root flare is again exposed to air and the environment and all the things that it naturally would be. And that kind of creates a difficult management situation in the landscape where you constantly have mulch that wants to kind of pour back in there. And so, you just have to kind of keep that pulled back over time. So another treatment option that I always have to mention with this is to really consider removal before this tree becomes a hazard. In the case of larger trees like this red maple at the top, that we see some pretty significant trunk constriction going on. If the tree was healthy and fine, it had normal twig growth, a full canopy, I would say be a plant that we need to watch over time and not worry about, but keep an eye on and really have an annual assessment of its health. But if we're already seeing signs of decline up there, if we're already seeing really tiny small leaves compared to what a normal red maple would have, not much twig growth, probably early fall color, then it really needs to be a hard discussion with that homeowner about potentially removing this plant before it is a hazard in the landscape. So if there's a target close to it, it becomes a real hazard as it starts to lose some of its stability from the rot that's right behind that trunk constriction. So that's an assessment that may need to actually be made by a certified arborist to determine how and when to remove it. But it really begins with kind of an assessment of that tree's health. So what are the reasons? We've talked about a little bit of this already. What are the reasons that we would have no root flare like we see on the linden at the left, which is kind of an example I've already showed. But the number one cause is planting too deep. So we're going to talk about that a lot today, how we can plant a tree at the right depth, and I'll show you how to kind of make that assessment with some pictures from the field. But we've already talked about kind of some grading or changes in changes in that area. I think a common thing I've seen folks do is add a few bricks and a little landscaping bed around the base of a tree, and that raises up the soil level right there. Looks really nice and neat, but it's buried that root flare inadvertently. Trunk damage we've kind of already covered, but in the case of the cherry at the right there, we see a little bit of a root flare here, probably what's going to be a girdling root, maybe with a little trunk constriction right there, but maybe not in other areas. But right here, the shadow of the sun, unfortunately, kind of didn't show this area great, but we can see a lot of damage right there in either a canker or just a damage and some rot. So in this case, we have no basal flare right here. We've kind of saw this on the hickory before, where it's not always a big gaping hole. Sometimes it's just dead bark that are kind of an indicator of that, and a dead area that's maybe not always as obvious as this, that indicates we don't have a great root flare there, and in that area, that part of the structural root system is not present or has died from root color disorder. So when we look at some of what the literature says with relation to planting too deep, this 2000 study showed us that 93% of professionally installed plants in this study had soil or mulch. Mulch is not quite as bad as soil above the root flare, but also an issue on a ton of plants in that study. Another study in the 90s looked at nursery grown trees, and coming out of the nursery, these plants had their root flares buried in either the pot they were in or the ball and burlap 3 to 12 inches deep in a good majority of the nursery grown plants. And I would say that although that study was done back in the 90s, that's about the time I started my career as an arborist. Today, I'm seeing the same kind of plant material from all the places that I get plants every year that's in the same condition as it was in the late 90s. So there's some issues at the nursery, and none of it, most all of it is fixable at planting time. So finally, the last little bit I put here is just that when roots are in deeper soil layers, it makes sense. They have access to water, oxygen, and nutrients is limited. is changed and maybe limited. So that access to those three things that tree roots need is more present in the upper layers of the soil. So planting too deep puts those roots deeper than the location of the soil where we find a lot of those basic things that trees need. So so again, a lot of this in addressing root collar disorders, a lot of it comes back to how and the way we plant trees. So let's talk a little bit about planting trees. I'm going to cover a little bit about both container plants and balled and burlap trees like you see on the left there. So just some real basic tips here. But the one thing I really want to stress is just that the first step before you ever dig your planting hole is to find that root flare. So like we saw from that last statistic, a lot of times these plants come out of the nursery with that root flare already buried in the pot or the ball and burlap. So if we dig our hole, the depth of that, and then later find out that the root flare is down in the ball or in the pot a little ways, our hole's too deep. So before you ever dig, first start to try and find that root flare. And we'll look at that on the next slide here, how to kind of identify that on the different plants. But you always want to dig. A good recommendation is to dig your hole about 3 times the width of that, either the root ball or the pot. So folks always want to know how wide should I dig my planting hole. So a big aspect in tree planting of the size of the hole is that you want a really wide and shallow hole. We don't really need a very deep hole, and we'll see that with examples I show in a minute. But we want it nice and wide. So if you have to set a number to it, about 3 times the width of that existing root ball that you're putting down in the hole, you want your hole that much wider, and that allows that plant, as it's overcoming transplant shock. When we plant a tree, it's in a state of shock for a number of years after planting. It gives it some nice loose soil right around there that it can expand its root system out into and overcome transplant shock that much quicker. We think that about 3 times the width of what it was planted with will help as opposed to a smaller size. So as you're digging your hole, assess that soil quality. And it's not a super technical assessment that I'm talking about, but look for natural soil horizons. In this part of central Illinois, we have a really deep soils and horizons, that as you go down into the soil profile deeper, you should see different defined horizons. So in central Illinois, we have a very deep first horizon that you would see in that soil. So we really shouldn't see a huge amount of change as we start to dig down. Other areas have less of an A horizon, or that first horizon of the soil. But look for a natural change. If the soil starts to change color as you're digging down, it should be a consistent kind of change that continues. Whereas in a lot of urban areas, like this median that we see here where this little oak was planted, as you start to dig, it's just a mixture of subsoil, of fill materials that were a result of all this construction around this little tree that happened probably 50 years before it was planted here. But and so look to see if it's a mixed up mixture of different colors of soil. Safe to say it's probably a pretty disturbed soil, and I might consider actually amending that backfill with a little bit of organic matter in the way of just compost, finished compost, or anything that you can kind of add to get a little bit more organic matter in there. But most times, if that seems to be okay, I don't really amend soil. I backfill with that same material there. So finally, applying mulch helps preserve moisture and overcome transplant shock. And biggest mistake with mulch is that we pile it up against the root flare, and we get right back to the same situation we were if we didn't plant it at the right depth. So be sure that mulch is pulled back away from the tree trunk. So let's look at a few examples of container trees that just this fall here I planted around my property. And so we have a river birch and a red bud. And as you can see on the river birch, I can see this first structural root right here, and it's kind of hard to see, but that's the other kind of first root, and there's a third one back here. So that root flare is right at the top of the material in the pot. So that's pretty good. But on my red bud, it's always difficult to capture this with photography, but it's pretty far down in this hole right here. That's a bowl-shaped depression where I've dug all the soil away, and you can see where the soil line was on this stem. And there's the first root down there. That little hint of light color is that first root. So this was pretty deep in the pot. So when I had to go to measure my planting depth, I had to account for that. And so you know, I had to kind of estimate from the tip top of this, how far down was that first root, and then, you know, measure off to the side with the tape. And gosh, you know, for this about 8-inch almost height of pot, I really only needed about a 5-inch deep hole. So that's not very deep at all. And even on the river birch, it becomes a bit of a challenge to figure out its depth because there's this little bit of a lip to the pot. So, you know, I wasn't really even planting this the full depth of the pot. So if you're ever in question, I tend to err on the side of a shallower hole rather than a deeper hole. And again, you know, to try and keep that root flare at the soil surface. And I don't really have a great picture of this from fall tree planting this year, but a great way to figure out that depth is to get this measurement, say 5 inches. And after you dig your hole, if you just lay a shovel handle across the hole, you can use this tape in the same way to measure down off the shovel handle. And it's just a real down and dirty in the field way to kind of guess. Another way is just to kind of set the pot in there and look and estimate. But one big issue with this is once we get this red bud in the hole, then we've got a lot of material right here that's kind of up and above, you know, our root flare, that all around this pot, there's, you know, several inches of material that if we can, it would be great to remove. A lot of times with potted plants, there's just a mass of roots in here, and it's just a thick, and you can almost see on my last slide that there was, you know, quite a bit of root material around the edge here of this hole. So it sometimes becomes difficult to get all of this material removed down to this level. So in this case, I tend to plant this kind of high and have mulch heaped up around it and let over time, just as the mulch decomposes and the tree continues to grow, things kind of even out over the next 5 years or so as that plant's kind of planted a little high. But the main thing is, in the end, we hope that root flare staying up as high as we can get it, as close to the soil surface as we can. So now let's take a look at an example of a Baldwin burlap plant that I planted this is just last spring, a service berry that I got from the nursery. And if you can see here, I've opened up the Baldwin burlap, and I wish I would have taken a picture before I started to undo this and had dug the planting hole, but you get busy doing these things and I forget to always take all the pictures that I would want. But anyway, you can see that, you know, the top of this root ball, gosh, it was, I don't know if that's 6 or 8 inches of difference, but it was, soil was even up around where these first couple stems came out of the trunk. So it's pretty high up there where my root flare just barely started to come out down here. And it's really kind of an odd shaped trunk that kind of tapers down towards where the first roots started to come out. So really a sign of kind of an unnatural condition this tree was in the ball. So what I did was, again, before I planted, measured this height and accounted for that when I dug my hole. And so it did wind up right about at the soil surface, thankfully, when I got done. But some of this, you know, is all an estimate. And I guess one thing to note is, you know, this hole certainly isn't as wide as I talked about we should do. And the reason for that is that we had a large tree trunk. Here's the last round. That's not actually a trunk. It's just a round off of that trunk I cut down a couple of years ago. A dead oak tree that had to be cut down here. And all this area was extensively stump ground. So to get all the roots out and everything. And so really everything under the mulch here was kind of loose fill. So I felt like I didn't need to make much of a hole. And to not disturb the soil, I used a couple sheets of plywood to step on as I was walking around in there to kind of keep, not work backwards on this. But, you know, notice I did remove the burlap, especially the twine that was up around the trunk. On that last example, we saw of a red maple that had some of this material left in place. This twine was still around the trunk that I removed. And most of this wire cage I removed as well. There's some of this wire cage is still down below. So there's been a lot of discussion of this recently. Should you remove stuff? Should you leave it? I would refer you guys to a couple resources here on this next slide, where Dr. Daniel from Purdue University has a great kind of discussion on a Facebook, I think it was a live video he broadcast that kind of talks about this transplanting. And then Dr. Andrew Kozer, this is a nice podcast he recorded that kind of discusses it all. And I guess, you know, the bottom line with what we've seen from research, there's actually some research that builds the case to not remove most of that stuff. But in any case where we've had that discussion, we definitely need to remove what's around the trunk and constricting it. Whereas nowadays we don't use, nurseries used to use a treated type of burlap. And in that case, that stuff definitely doesn't decompose, but there's some research that shows that burlap down there doesn't necessarily impede root growth as much as we used to think. So there's maybe a case that we could leave that down there. Out of necessity, I've kept the bottom of the wire cage on some of those Baldwin burlap plants, but removed everything up above. I remove all the burlap because I just feel like anything that's stopping root, that can restrict root growth at all, is a bad idea. And so for me, the science kind of goes in either favor of removing or keeping some of that material. I just feel like for the couple minutes it takes to pull it off, I cut it all as much off as I can, and just, if there's a little bit of wire basket or burlap in the bottom of the hole, I don't worry so much about that. But anyway, tune into those if you want to hear the whole scoop. And just while I'm at it, I really love this Science of Arboriculture podcast that ISA puts out, the International Society of Arboriculture. Check it out. It's free, it's out there, and it's just a regular thing that I listen to. And so back to the science behind all this. I really like this 2006 study that kind of looked at, planting depth and girdling root formation to kind of explore this relationship. So they looked at two different tree species, red maple and Yoshino cherry, about 2-inch caliper trees and 30 of each species. They had 3 different planting depth treatments, so 3 different levels. So their control was the root flare at the grade. The first treatment was 6 inches deep, and the next one was 12 inches deep. And so they compared those 3 different treatments across a 3-year study. So it's not necessarily a long-term study, but 1 year after planting, we saw that maples had a higher root density, so they had more dense roots. Planting depth did not have an effect on root density 1 year post-planting. So that's interesting to me. Planting depth did have a strong effect on root distribution. So deep planted trees had fewer roots in those upper soil layers. And remember, that those upper soil layers are kind of where we expect to see a lot of roots that are, getting water and nutrients and the things they need. Interestingly, 2 years post-planting, 50% of all those deep planted cherries died, but it had no effect on maple survival. So that's super interesting to me. And at the 3rd year of their final assessment, planting depth really didn't have effect on girdling roots on cherries, but had a significant effect on maples. And I've got a little bit more of this information on the next slide too of conclusions, so I'm going to skip to that. Overall results of the study, planting depth, deep planting had a significant effect on cherry health, but no effect on formation of girdling roots. So that's an interesting difference. Girdling root development on maples was definitely significantly impacted by deep planting. And those deep planted trees had fewer roots in the upper soil layers. Makes a lot of sense. And then finally, I'm on the next slide here, I'll have some numbers about, red maples and how much of their trunk was constricted. So 3 years at the end of the study, the control maples had around 14%, give or take, of their trunks girdled, where the 6-inch deep maples had up to 48%, and the 12-inch deep maples had 71% of their trunk encircled by girdling roots. So this shows, a difference between the 2 species in the study, definitely, but also really points the finger at red maples. And you'll see that's kind of a common theme where that's throughout the rest of my presentation here, where red maples really are highly susceptible to girdling root formation and really need to be watched for that. So just some other research to throw in there that, root depth and stem girdling roots definitely affect tree health. We've already seen some studies that kind of show that. Here's a list of kind of some others over time that have shown that relationship as well. And I really like this 2021 study where they compared sugar maple, hackberry, green ash, and little leaf linden. And they found that for every centimeter too deep, 3.3% of the stem was encircled by girdling roots. So that's kind of just an interesting number to think about, where if you're around 4 inches deep or 10 centimeters, that's about a third of the trunk encircled. So that's pretty significant. And why I kind of report that number of 1/3 is that's always where I think of is the cut. One of the recommendations is we can prune a tree canopy and remove about a third safely in a healthy tree. I always kind of look at if I'm assessing the health of a tree and a third of the canopy's impact, I start to really think that's a big impact. So Gosh, to have a 30-year trunk restricted by girdling roots just at 4 inches too deep is a big deal. So with that, let's talk about looking at some root collar excavations of trees already in the landscape. And this is a picture of this little black gum we saw earlier. And this was a very recently planted black gum that, really has that telephone pole appearance. We can see a little bit of a flare down there, but not much. Pretty telephone pole looking. And so as I got down into this and dug down, look at all the potentially girdling roots that we can see here, that if that had been left, you can see the old soil line was right up around here. Someday those would be contacting this trunk tissue, because the start of that first root, I know it's hard to see because of the color of the soil, but the start of that first structural root is right down here. And same on the other side, it was right about at the same height right here. And so, especially this root would not take too long to constrict the trunk. And so, some of this relates to the kind of the unnatural condition in a nursery, why all this happens and why this is so prevalent. First, it's the deep planting. But secondly, when this tree was dug at the nursery, a lot of the larger roots are cut off by that tree spade that pulls it out. This is a balled and burlap tree. And when those roots are cut at the tips, it causes growth in other parts of the root system, where normally some of these roots that are smaller and up close to the trunk over time would be some of those finer roots that kind of turn over and die and aren't a big issue, where now with this tree kind of in this unnatural condition and being dug out of the nursery, a lot of these lateral roots through here that may not have been bigger players in the root system actually are in this case, and can cause some trunk constriction over time. So let's look at another tree in the same area, another, about 2 or 3 inch caliper, balled and burlapped, bald cypress that was planted. And you can see doesn't have a heck of a lot of a trunk flare. We can see a little bit of one on this. And so as we did the root collar excavation on this, we could find it wasn't super deep. You can see where the old soil line is, and you can see, this first couple roots coming out here. But what we didn't have is on the backside here. I think I have a picture on my next slide of kind of this backside of the trunk, where you can see there's the first root coming out that I dug down to and said, okay, this is my level of the root flare. But on the backside, I didn't find that. I found this kind of odd root growing. And so this is a pretty common condition in nursery dug plants that I've seen over the years, where we don't always have this uniform root flare going around. And you kind of have sometimes adventitious roots like this that kind of spring up. And sometimes they're even growing, if this tree is really deep, higher up out of the trunk, which makes it really hard to kind of identify where that root flare is when you have sometimes some roots higher that have the trees put out. So you don't always find this perfectly uniform root flare. What I'm going for is I'm trying to find that first structural root, this big one right here, not this little tiny one. And so sometimes it takes a little extra. So don't stop when you find just the first bit of a root. I always try and go a little bit deeper and identify really the trunk, the basal flare. So what we're stuck with though in this situation is this, really deep hole right here where stuff's going to fall into. So my recommendation in trying to fix this for the long term and have mulch stick around right here a little easier is to try and kind of grade it off a little bit, like you can see I did with this tool. This is probably my favorite root collar excavation tool. I should have included a better picture for you all, but it doesn't have a very pointy end. It's kind of a flat end to it, and just it makes it really easy to kind of very carefully excavate and to scrape away the soil. And so I didn't find a lot of roots here. What you can run into is if there's a lot of roots up in this part of the ball, you may have to leave this kind of, unideal bowl-shaped thing here. But if you can scrape off some, that's the best way to do it, is to kind of pull that down a little bit, and just watching for roots as you're grading is my best kind of recommendation there. And so there's kind of the final product. I put, a little tiny bit of mulch, just enough to kind of cover the soil around, right around the trunk, and then kind of layered it out a little bit from there. But and so what I've found in these, existing trees that are planted in the landscape is that you have a couple different conditions that you can see, where, here's our old kind of ball, and this is probably a little big compared to the trunk size, but it's, for illustrations purposes, that's kind of what I've included. And the red line is kind of where we excavate to, where this is the ideal situation. And that's kind of what happened with that cypress, is mostly clear of roots. And we're able to kind of make this nicely tapering hole where, you know, in the worst case, there's been some root development that's happened in here, and it would be just, it kind of takes a judgment call on how many roots I'm going to impact to try and grade to get this. And so there's times you just have to kind of stop and leave it really, really steep like this, and just understand that it's going to be a maintenance issue. You're going to have to kind of pull mulch out of there over time. And so this is just another example of a magnolia tree that was struggling a little bit, and you can see it was really planted up to about right here, right in this area, but really the colors kind of fades off right there. But I couldn't really make a great excavation around this because, as you can see, there's a lot of little roots. So I'm guessing that this thing that is going to potentially be a girdling root someday is probably the top of the pot this was planted in, or up in the pot. So the pot was probably about that height or so across the plant. And so it was one of those where I had to just leave this really kind of unnaturally steep thing. And really it's a plant that I'm going to watch over time. And if eventually, if we felt like its health improved, and it was planted maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's not a very big tree. It was just a 1 gallon potted plant. I'd be looking to maybe keep this root exposed and eventually maybe remove it. But I always like to do that slowly and carefully if I can. So quickly, let's look at kind of one more study. And I like this one because it compares different species to show some of these differences. And we know that you know, species are definitely differ in their you know, their likelihood of hosting girdling roots. And so in this case, they looked at the species you see listed here. Of course, red maple was the worst with 8.9 girdling roots per tree, but I was really surprised to see that linden did the best out of this study. And in my experience, I've had a lot of issues with lindens and girdling roots, and I mean, mostly all related to planting depth over the years. But a lot of times when somebody called me with an ailing linden, that was one of the things I first thought of. So, I mean, I think it just kind of illustrates that, well, I don't have scientific data behind the fact that I think lindens are bad. I've seen that as an issue in the landscape, and field conditions and growing conditions can differ by geography. And so while we know there's differences among species, it's never a safe bet to say one is good or bad, although there are some recommendations we can go by. And I think it's on the next slide, I'll kind of have some of that listed. But, you know, conclusions from this study: girdling roots were more common on maples among, you know, the different species. 2/3 of girdling roots formed within 2 years of planting. So that's a pretty significant thing to think about. They actually took the age of all the roots that they found that were girdling and could trace them back to relate them to planting time on these. You know, these were older, more established plants. So what they decided, what their best recommendation is that 4 to 6 years post-planting is that optimal time to do a root collar excavation on a tree that's too deeply planted, and try to take those girdling roots out before they're affecting the trunk. And they found that after that, you're having major problems from those girdling roots. An interesting thing they also looked at, it was a study of street trees. And the last bullet point here is that girdling roots may not be a problem on mature red and silver maples that they saw that were around 30 years of age. That, you know, some of those older trees, maybe they didn't have those girdling root issues as a younger plant, or for whatever reason, they just didn't have those at a later time, where Norway maple, gosh, I've seen a lot of Norway maples with this issue, was really had that problem up and down. So I like to look at this list, though, of girdling roots by species, and it comes from this great guide you see listed at the bottom from Minnesota Extension. I've used this publication for years to kind of look at everything about girdling roots, how to assess them and address them in the landscape. And it kind of has a list of the species that are most susceptible. Most of note to me, at least, so this is my experience in, you know, central and southern Illinois, where I've done most of my arboriculture work. These are the species that are the big ones for me that I worry about the most. You know, red maples and bold as one of the worst, but, you know, among the conifers, blue spruce, Norway spruce, white pine, Austrian pine has been a really bad one for me over the years. Crab apples and dogwoods out of our smaller trees. Those are some that I've seen, a lot of issues with girdling roots on. So how I address that is just if we're planting one of these species, I'm really careful to plant it at the right depth and to really look for girdling roots. If somebody has one of these plants that has a health ailment, I'm really looking towards the base of the trunk first as a sign for girdling roots are an issue there. So let's kind of wrap things up today by talking about, assessment of mature trees in the landscape. And so really, over the years, I've learned that when somebody's reporting a tree ailment, a basic inspection, just visual inspection of the root collar is one of the first things that I do recommend. And, a lot of times I have clients send me a picture of that root flare or the absence of it. And so that's kind of the start of just any tree health assessment for me. But, I'm looking for the presence or absence of that root flare. A lot of the signs that we've talked about before: fruiting bodies, sloughing bark, sunken bark, signs of mechanical damage. So that's really in any ailing tree, that's one of the first things I look at. Here's our Norway maple example from earlier. And, I kind of discussed this in context of remove a tree before it's a hazard. Amazingly, this plant really has pretty good annual twig growth. It really looks like above ground, if you look above about 2 feet down where this damage to the trunk is, it looks amazingly healthy. However, this is a plant that, look at the trunk constriction there, and you really can see the girdling, just a massive girdling roots here. And, it's caused the death of this trunk. Now, very interesting to see that woundwood kind of growing there, and look at how the trees responded. That's really cool to see. But gosh, between this mark and, that's the same face you see right there. How much of that trunk is constricted? A lot more than a third. As I kind of feel like is, if once 1/3 of it's constricted, that's kind of a rule of thumb of it's getting bad. So, even though it's showing no signs of poor health, like based on how much of the root flare is gone, there definitely can't be a very active support structure of roots right here. I would recommend removal of this before it gets worse. Now, in other cases, it does take a careful assessment of kind of tree health with respect to that. So when I look at the Austrian pine at the left there, look at how much it tapers the wrong direction going down into the ground. Now, if I had a pine, that's a great candidate for a root collar excavation. But if I had a half dead canopy, gosh, it's not a hard decision to think that thing needs to actually be removed if there was a target around it. I guess that's one thing to look at. On the last tree example, it was very close to the house. Like it's very likely it could fall and hit that house, or there was a child swing on it. There's just a lot of things in that area that it could impact. Where, the white pine at the right, I don't see much trunk constriction from that girdling root. It's kind of a weird one, the way it's laying across the trunk tissue. I think with a completely healthy tree, in that case, I'd probably be pretty comfortable cutting those girdling roots. And I don't really have a great recommendation for what is the size of girdling root you can cut successfully and not expect to impact the plant. I think it involves assessment of the canopy health and other signs. In the case of this white pine, it was a really healthy plant. It had some phenomenal annual twig growth. And so I would feel comfortable in this case cutting a girdling root that size. You also need to consider, as we look at this next picture, tulip poplar we saw a little bit earlier, the amount of trunk constriction we're getting. And that's pretty significant right here. And I don't know how much if we excavated, we might find back here, because there's not much of a basal flare on this side. This plant was, next to an outbuilding and a deck, and has had kind of some erosion in this area that's caused accumulation of soil around here. So it's just in a bad spot for where runoff happens along the edge of this deck. And I don't know. I worry about this plant quite a bit because it doesn't have much of a root zone. Where that white pine we looked at in the last picture, completely free and open root zone, is actually in a park setting. So this one at a homeowner's house, gosh, I think it's probably a safe route to cut, but I would want to excavate and figure out how much trunk constriction we have here. And I'd want to think about, what's the health of the canopy above this. I know There's a lot of problem with tulip scale from this plant based on complaints from what's accumulated on the deck. So that's sometimes signs of a weaker plant because that's kind of happened. So it's a tricky question of, we don't have really great guidance from the literature on how big of a girdling root can we successfully cut and not kill or help the tree. But there's a lot of cases, like in the case of that Norway maple we looked at, there's no way it's going to miraculously get better from that. Its condition's only going to get worse as it gets larger and has more above ground growth to support with a smaller root system. So some of that's the assessment on mature trees when you have girdling roots or root collar issues. And some of it just has to do with, we talked about an example of a red maple earlier, where pretty bad constricting roots around the trunk, but pretty good health of the above ground parts and no sign of it slowing down. So maybe just a plant to watch in some cases. So what are some of the conclusions that we can draw from today's discussion? Proper tree planting is one of the best preventions. And I just can't stress that anymore, just due to the fact that deep planting can impact health in so many ways. And I love the recommendation that, the first 4 to 6 years after planting, if you have a plant that has those issues, that's kind of our window to fix that before those impacts tend to intensify. We've talked about, not only is this important in assessing the root collar zone, but just at any tree that has a health issue that we're addressing, let's look at that first as one of the potential causes or a combination of things. We know the girdling roots vary by species. There's kind of a list I posted in there and a reference that you can look at to kind of assess, think about that as you're planting or dealing with those particular species. And girdling roots can be removed in some cases, but as we've talked about over these last couple of slides here, in mature trees, that's really going to take a professional assessment, and that may be the point at which you go ahead and call an arborist and get that assessment done if you're not sure. So before we just start cutting off those girdling roots, you really need to look at the whole picture for the plant. So with that, I'd love to refer you to our 4 Seasons Gardening series on YouTube, where this recording will be posted eventually once we get it edited and up there. But it houses all of our past recordings and a bunch of great topics on trees and everything else horticulture that other extension folks have presented over the years. And finally, we do have a bit of an assessment. If you wouldn't mind filling out a brief survey about today's presentation, we have some feedback we'd love to get from you, and you can either go to the link you see there, or you can scan the QR code to respond to that.